Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive, data-driven report co-published by the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute, the newly released 2025 Human Freedom Index. It's an incredibly ambitious project, trying to paint a truly measurable, highly accurate picture of exactly how free we are as a global population. Whether you track economics, civil liberties, or just the general trajectory of human rights, this data offers a profound look at exactly where we stand today.
But hey, before we look at a single data point, we have to tackle a really fundamental question. Freedom is a word that gets thrown around a lot, right? Philosophers, politicians, everyday folks, everyone has an entirely different definition of what it actually means to be truly free. Does it mean having everything you need provided for you, or does it mean the total absence of rules? If we're going to quantify freedom on a global scale, we need a rock-solid objective definition to start with.
So, the researchers anchor this index in the 20th century philosopher Isaiah Berlin's concept of negative liberty. Now, negative here doesn't mean bad. It simply means freedom is defined by the absence of something, specifically the absence of coercive constraint. It means having the right to lead your life exactly as you wish, to do, say, or think anything you want, provided you don't infringe on the equal rights of others to do the exact same thing. Fundamentally, it's all about strict non-interference.
Because of this specific definition, the index actually draws a hard line in the sand. It firmly rejects what's known as positive liberty. You see, positive liberty often focuses on removing constraints that impede someone's potential, things like a lack of income or housing. But the authors point out a catch here. Guaranteeing positive liberty almost always requires state coercion, basically taking resources from some to fulfill the potential of others. Because of that required coercion, the Human Freedom Index strictly measures negative liberty, just your freedom from arbitrary interference by others and the state.
To enforce this idea of non-interference, the report leans on a foundational philosophy from John Locke. He essentially argued that a strong rule of law is actually the absolute prerequisite for true freedom. Think about it. Without legal security, without a highly predictable justice system that applies equally to the highest government official and the average citizen, liberty is kind of meaningless. You literally can't exercise your freedom of speech or religion or commerce if your physical safety and your property aren't legally protected from the arbitrary will of others.
Which brings us to our first main section. Section 1, the Freedom Formula Methodology. Let's look at how they actually measure this. Taking a grand abstract concept like liberty and measuring it globally requires a seriously robust methodology. And this index is massive. It's built upon 87 distinct, measurable indicators of human freedom. The researchers aren't just checking a box on whether a country holds elections, they're looking at 87 very specific criteria. We're talking homicide rates, the harassment of journalists, tariff rates, even whether men and women have equal inheritance rights. They really leave no stone unturned here.
Now, those 87 indicators are evenly split into two major pillars: personal freedom and economic freedom. Personal freedom encompasses things we traditionally think of, like the rule of law, security, movement, and expression. Economic freedom covers sound money, free trade, property rights, and minimal regulation. And here's the key. The authors argue you absolutely cannot look at these in isolation. They're deeply intertwined, which is exactly why they give them equal weight in the final score.
To understand exactly why economic freedom gets that equal weighting, the authors cite a pretty chilling realization from Leon Trotsky. When we think of freedom, we usually prioritize free speech or the right to vote, right? But without the power to make your own economic decisions, the state holds the ultimate tools of coercion over every other aspect of your life. As Trotsky noted, if a government is your sole employer, they don't even need to officially ban free speech. Opposition just means death by slow starvation. Economic freedom is essentially what empowers you to exercise all your other freedoms.
We definitely won't list all 87 individual indicators today, but just know that they all roll up into 12 overarching categories. 7 fall under personal freedom, like religion, association, and relationships. The other 5 fall under economic freedom, like property rights, trade, and regulation. Each of these 12 categories is graded on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the absolute maximum level of freedom. A country's final Human Freedom Index score is simply the average of these 12 categories.
All right, moving right along into Section 2, the global rankings. Where are we free? Let's get into the actual results.
So, moving from theory to hard reality, let's look at the global landscape for the 165 jurisdictions they measured. And wow, there is a stark regional disparity here. The deepest oranges and reds represent the lowest levels of freedom, while the pale yellows represent the highest. North America, Western Europe, and Oceania shine bright with very high freedom scores.
But as you shift your attention over to the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, you start to see severe restrictions on liberty. It is a highly, highly unequal picture globally.
Breaking that global picture down, we can see the literal extremes of human liberty. Switzerland takes the absolute #1 spot overall, with a phenomenal score of 9.15 out of 10, followed very closely by Denmark, New Zealand, Ireland, and Luxembourg. But on the flip side, we have nations trapped in deep conflict and authoritarianism. Myanmar, Sudan, Yemen, and Iran sit right at the bottom, with Syria taking the absolute lowest rank at 165th place, scoring just 3.27.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter for my everyday life? Well, this data brilliantly illustrates that it isn't just an abstract academic exercise. There is a massive, tangible correlation between a country's freedom score and its prosperity. Get this, jurisdictions in the top, most free quartile of this index enjoy an average per capita income of over $53,000. For those living in the bottom, least free quartile, that number plummets to just over $14,000. Freedom and human well-being are, for sure, inextricably linked.
However, the really sobering reality of this data reveals a massive inequality in liberty. You might assume the global population is spread somewhat evenly across these scores, right? Well, actually, scratch that. They absolutely aren't. A staggering 76% of the world's population lives in the bottom half of the Freedom Index. Only about 13.8% actually get to experience life in that top, freest quartile. This enormous disparity is largely driven by highly populated nations, particularly China, scoring deep in the lowest quartile of the index.
Okay, let's dive into Section 3, A World Less Free, the pandemic's long shadow.
This brings us to probably the most startling data point in the entire explainer, the pretty terrifying downward trend of the last few years. The data paints a very clear timeline. Following a global high point for freedom around 2007, the world entered a period of slow, steady decline leading up to 2019. But then, 2020 hit. The global response to the coronavirus pandemic caused global freedom to take a catastrophic nosedive. And to be clear, the authors note they aren't judging the public health effectiveness of these policies. They are strictly measuring their impact on liberty. And that impact was devastating. What's worse, 4 years later, in 2023, the data shows human freedom has completely plateaued. It has failed to recover and remains far below the levels we enjoyed way back in the year 2000.
The sheer scale of this specific recent decline is honestly hard to fathom. Between 2019 and 2023, 89.6% of the entire global population saw their freedom fall. Think about that. Nearly 9 out of every 10 people on Earth are living in a jurisdiction that is noticeably less free today than it was just a few years ago before the pandemic. 121 jurisdictions decreased their scores, while only 42 managed to scrape out an increase.
And this decline wasn't isolated to one specific region or one type of government either. Major nations across the globe, representing totally different geopolitical realities, experienced significant deteriorations. Argentina dropped from 7.61 down to 6.91. Russia, which was already quite low, fell even further to 4.86. Even India, the world's most populous democracy, saw its score drop from 6.74 down to 6.26. This is a truly global phenomenon, hitting freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, and even access to sound money.
Which brings us to the final, critical takeaway of our explainer today. The researchers highlight a tough reality. A crisis almost always expands the power of the state. But reversing that expansion, that's incredibly difficult. So the data leaves us with this very urgent question. As the memory of the pandemic fades, are we permanently living in a less free world? Have these emergency constraints simply become the new baseline for human existence? And most importantly, what will you do to understand and preserve the liberties that still remain? I highly recommend digging into the full data set for your specific region, because understanding exactly where freedom is eroding is the first crucial step to getting it back.